Okay, hello everyone and welcome to Handmade Hero, the show where we code a complete game live on stream. Yesterday we stopped short of implementing any world generation stuff because we had just sort of finished saying what the API was we were going to start with. We had written some usage code, but not actually implementing it. So what we want to do today is to kind of start pushing forward on that and to make some actual implementations of this code. And what we're going to have to do, and we probably won't be able to finish this all today, is we're going to have to start working on some code that can put rooms down into a spatial arrangement that obeys certain ideas about how those rooms should be connected. And this is actually a relatively tricky problem to solve, largely because there isn't a lot of information in the system about where things should be. One of the things that's generally true in any kind of generative system, or just even when you're talking about asking a computer to do things like layout, and you can think about these sorts of things separate from game design. Imagine something very simple like page layout, for example. So there's different kinds of ways you can lay out, say, text on a page, like books layout or magazine layout. So one way is a prescriptive way of laying out. And that's like something like HTML, right? Which is, I would generally consider like the garbage version of page layout. And what that is that's something that has only the most rudimentary ability to adjust things. It's basically just says, hey, look, we don't know how long these lines of text are, so we're just going to do stuff like you can tell me maybe like how wide to do, and I'll like make something, I'll make it as long as it needs to be to fit the text after I wrap it or something, right? And so you can kind of have garbage versions like that, and we could make a garbage version like that for our game as well, which would basically just, hey, you pretty much have to tell me everything, and I'm just going to plunk down rooms very mechanically, and that's all I can do, right? But a step up from that, and when you start to get into actual real programming at that point, is when there's multiple ways you could be doing something, and the computer is expected to evaluate different options based on some heuristics or something, right? So for example, another way that page layout systems have worked in the past is, for example, you give a bunch of different hypothetical layouts that a page might have, and then the system looks at the different ways that the pages would fit on a certain display and picks the one that's best by some criteria, like most amount of the text fits on the page, or the least number of run-ons, or the width of the text is the best for reading compared to what it should normally be, and blah, 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 right? And so basically, like, we want that kind of system. We're not going to go crazy with it because, again, it's Handmade Hero. I'm just trying to show you how to do things. I'm not going to spend 800 episodes talking about all the different ways to make constraint solvers and all sorts of other sorts, because that's an entire thing that we could go down for years and years. But we do want a little bit of that. So what we want to be able to do is we want to be able to have the layout system make actual decisions about multiple ways in which it could lay something out. And that becomes relatively complicated. And the reason it's relatively complicated, again, is because it's a little bit loose, right? There's no right answer to the layout problem in the way that we normally like problems to have an answer, right? We like closed form solutions to things when we're programming because they're so much simpler. We just write a few lines of code and it computes the answer and we're done. By contrast, things that involve minimizing error metrics or evaluating different things based on scoring criteria, or having an infinite number of ways you might lay things out and trying to search for the one that scores the highest on something, right? These involve more complex, more error-prone, more difficult algorithms that are harder to manage. And so there's no mystery as to why, something like a browser doesn't do it. It's because, it was this kind of thing that came from people who didn't really know text layout, and that wasn't something they were experts in or anything like that. So, they're not going to tackle something like that, right? They're going to do simpler. And since then, it's just been people like arguing about how much DRM there should be or whatever, right? But we don't have to do that. We can actually try to be a little bit better. So what we want to do is look at some algorithms that involve these sorts of softer solves and see if we can't make something that's workable in our context. And this is not unheard of. There are some games out there that are procedurally generated that do stuff like that. Some games that are procedurally generated, or maybe perhaps most games that are procedurally generated, don't really do that. But there definitely are some that do. And so, I've even seen people do stuff like use a physics spring system to lay out rooms, They just pack all the rooms together and they add repulsive forces and they just let them poof out and then they connect them up after the fact, And so even that, although it is repurposing another kind of system to do the layout, even that is a much more sophisticated layout system than something like HTML, right? It has an organic way of iterating through a number of possible states and letting them balance out into something that was not preconceived, right? And so there's definitely games out there that are doing this sort of thing. They all do it a little bit differently, and that's understandable because game design is a very tweaky subject. There's a lot of personal opinion in it. There's a lot of unknowns. It's not a science. And so it's expected that things like what lays out the game would, of course, be something that has a lot of different approaches to it. We don't really care which approach we get. I just want us to get something a little past the rote sort of non-constraint or evaluation-based version so that you can kind of see a little bit about how you might implement something better than, a browser, right? If there's one thing I hope people can do at the end of Handmade here, it's something better than HTML. So anyway, if I go ahead and take a look at where we are in the game right now, well, I guess that doesn't actually make any sense. We are still at the point where we're not generating anything because we nerfed the code that actually generates the world. So yeah, there's that. Let me go ahead and head on back there then. And the other thing that I would like to do, just real quick before we start implementing this code, is I want to go fix the fact that our lighting system takes too long to start up. If you remember correctly, in our lighting pattern system here, we've got a thing for generating the lighting pattern, and we go through and do all sorts of nonsense that is all really could be done offline, right? So what we want to do is kind of take this out of the equation, I suppose. In fact, I could just do it offline. Because if you look at what's going on here, right, when we do the lighting pattern generators, here, let me move us in here. All this stuff is not really relevant. In fact, you know what? I look at too. There's probably still some stuff in there that we're doing for testing as well that we don't really need to do anymore. So let me go ahead and just see what stuff there, like this test func, like all this stuff we don't really want to do anymore either. So let me make sure that we're not doing any of that. Yeah, you can see it looks like we're probably not doing the testing anymore, so that's okay, right? However, we are still doing... We are still doing in here the test sum stuff. This stuff here might be most of our badness too, right? There we go. So really, I guess the long and short of it there was it was not really our generation code that was taking time. It was just our test code. Because remember, we were looking at some of the behavior of those patterns over time. So that was easier than I thought it was going to be. So that's a nice, that's good. But that means we can get right to it because we don't have to really spend any time on there then. All right. So what we want to do now is we want to start looking at the world generation, and we want to start implementing this this sort of pattern of stuff that we said that we want to do. And if we look down here at sort of the part that we've created, the create world call here, this code, all of this code now that is happening below here, that was sort of the old creation code, that code is really now kind of wants to become just reference code. We're going to look at that as we sort of move forwards here, but we really don't want this to be happening anymore, right? This stuff is not supposed to really be in the mix anymore, because that's just for creating the old test world stuff that we used to do, and we don't want that to happen anymore. So we want to restore to our assertion state, which is this one here, where there's nothing in the world at all, right? Nobody's creating anything, and the game can't start up because there's nothing there. There's nowhere to place the hero at the outset. And we want to get this create world call here working. So we want this spec that we created yesterday to take over for our world creation, and we want to go from there. So let's go ahead and start with that. I'm going to begin by just pointing out that our gen room spec is going to kind of stay nerfed for a little while. And so what I mean by that is we're not going to put anything in it. And the reason that we're not going to put anything in it is because the room spec is sort of for the second wave of generation that we're going to do. It will come into play in this generation probably, but mostly what it's for is filling in what's inside a room, not placing and connecting the rooms. So what we want to start out with is being able to place and connect rooms, and while that may involve knowing something about what's in them as we go, for the moment we just don't want to care about that. We want to start simple and just get rooms being placed with connections so that we can have that rudimentary version working properly. So if I go ahead here and say that this is just like, you know, sort of a to-do, and nothing's going to go in there, then I'm talking mostly about these. So we know, for starters, that the room connections, we do know what's going to be in them. A room connection says that, you know, a room A and a room B are connected, right? So we can say, like, we know that this is going to be information stored in the connection. And furthermore, what we probably also know, because connections are between two rooms, we probably also want them to be listed, right? So we probably want to do something that allows us to spin off of either. So we can say, like, all right, I've got a room and I want to loop over the connections from that room to any other room. And similarly, I want to do the opposite. Now, there's two different ways that you can do this. There's a database-oriented way you can do this, and there's a winged edge data structure way that you can do this. And really, which one you use is kind of depends on where you're looking to go with things. Handmade Hero, generally, we've done the winged edge style of things, so we're going to probably do that this time, but I'll just point out what the difference is. So if you are looking at things from a database style perspective, then what you typically talk about is something like a connection is what's usually referred to as a linking table. And what that is it's a piece of information that says that two other things in the database are related to each other, right? So I've got like this gen room here. I know I've got multiple gen rooms in a gen room table if it was a database, right? And then I've got a connection that says A and B are connected. And then the way that you process information, like give me all of the rooms connected to room B, is by a query that has some acceleration structure, and it could be any kind of acceleration structure, that then answers the question if room B appear, you know, if, or I should say room 12, let's say. If room 12 appears in either A or B of any connection, then it wants to be talked about here, right? So that's one way of storing that information, right? Another way of storing that information, and that way is typically if you have some existing system you just want to leverage, and you're going to rely on its indexing system to be good, to answer those queries quickly, right? Now, and furthermore, one thing you might do in those situations is you might create bidirectional connections. So you may say that every time you add a connection, not only do you say A, B, you also say B, A. So you create one in either direction, so you can just search on the first column and get all the connections that head out of room 12 without having to do two queries, one for where it appears in the A slot and one where it appears in the B slot, right? Okay. So that's one way to do this. Another way to do that is to just have rooms themselves store their exits, exits that come off of them, right? And so we can create a more verbose data structure by essentially welding the index into the data structures themselves. And this is kind of the reason I want to bring this up. Is a good point in anybody to talk about it. The difference between these two things. So in the database world and the way that you do those, the indices, the acceleration structures and the way that you walk the data is external to the data. And that's very important. That's the real distinction there when you talk about using a database. That's the important distinction, actually, right? And the data itself is just the data. So it's a segregation, if you will, of the way the data is accessed from what the data actually is. And there are good reasons to do this. I am not the kind of person who bags on databases. I think databases are interesting. And there's a lot of interesting design that went into thinking about them originally. COD was pretty smart. And do I think they get overused and used in situations where a database really isn't appropriate? Sure. But that's not the same thing as saying there aren't good ideas in there and ideas that should be understood. Everyone should probably read Transaction Processing by Gray, right? But in this case, why would we want all that extra stuff? Why do we want all of that externality? Why do we want all that segregation? Does it get us anything? And the answer in this case is probably going to be no. And that's why when we're creating something like this in a custom built thing in C, we usually want to go more for the throat, right? What we can do instead is say, look, we know how we're going to look at these connections. We know that the way that we're going to look at connections, generally speaking, is one of three ways. Either we're going to spin off of one of the rooms and say, show me all the things that are connected to this room. Or we're going to spin off of the opposite room, right? Like, tell me all the things that go to this room. And in our case, since it's bidirectional connections, I think always, those are the same queries. It's really only one. And then the second one is just, what are all the connections? So if we want to, we can just make the connection structure have all that information in it, and then all of our queries are direct. They never have to go through a secondary index. They can always be immediate and faster, right? So there's two different ways we can structure this. I'm not sure which way is the way that we most would like to do it, but I'll show you the two examples. So one example is we have a gen room connection, and this is just a linked list where what it does is it allows a room to store a list of connections off of it, and those connections are, stored here, right? Why would we introduce this? Why not just have the connection structure be something that's off the room and it just says what it connects to, and then both rooms have ones that point back to each other? Well, it depends. If you want to iterate over all connections and store something on the connection, that becomes a little harder to do because there's no unique place to do it, right? And so hopefully you understand what I'm saying there. If you don't, I'll spell it out for you a little bit more directly. One thing we could do is say, all right, every room has a pointer to its first connection. The connections are a linked list and just says what room it goes to, right? And what does this data structure look like? Well, what it means is that we've got a big set of rooms. Each room stores a connection to each other room, which is just a pointer that says I'm connected to this other room, right? Now what that means is there will be two room connection structures for every connection. One that goes from room A, and it's in room A's linked list, and it points to room B, and one that's in room B's linked list and points to room A. The downside here is that iterating over all the connections becomes impossible, sort of. Because what you have to do is when you iterate over one connection, you'd have to remember in sort of like a hash or something that you'd visited the connection one direction so that when you visit it the other direction, you don't count it twice, right? if you're going to do something to it, let's say. It also doesn't tell you where to store the information about the connection, because if you had information about the connection, do you put it in both places? Do you put it in only one of them? Do you have both of them point to something? In which case, you're back to what I was going to say next. So another way of doing this, and the way that I probably will do it, is again having sort of like a doubling, insulation layer, if you will, where we have a room connection is actually something that looks more like this. You know, we've got some information about the connection that goes in that spot, and then we have the two rooms, and we also have here a list of all of them, right? So essentially, what I'm saying there is not only do we have information about the two rooms, we have all of the connections total sort of linked up so that we can walk our connection list if we wanted to, right? So that's also something we could do. Again, we don't know how much we need some of these things, but I'm just going over all the ways that these sorts of things can sort of be structured, right? Oops, I put this in the wrong place. Sorry. Right? And now each room connection just has a pointer to the actual connection it's representing, right? And then it's got those, you know, all that information in there for whatever you need, and off you go. So that's going to be the most complicated structurally, because it is what creates the graph. And there's a lot of ways we can do it, and which way we want to do it, I think, will be more informed by, you know, sort of when we actually get to the part where we're iterating over these things. I think we can create them at that point. So what I'm going to do at the outset is I'm just going to make the most sort of verbose version here, which is the one that we've got like that looks like this. I'm just going to do that for now. And we'll do something more fancy when we start to see how we might want it to be laid out, because most of our routines will have to spin off these edges, and we probably want to make sure that they make some sense. That's all. All right. Also, I should mention while I'm in here, if you end up having to optimize this code, you may end up wanting to reduce the amount of pointer chasing, so you may end up bundling things together. For example, if rooms on average have 4 connections, you might just have an array of 4 pointers in the room directly that point to the rooms that they're connected to, and have a connection structure that's ancillary to them, and blah, 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 right? So none of this is about optimization. This is just about basic data representation. Optimization, if we need to do it at all, comes much later. And at that point, we would be thinking about other concerns, because we will have assumed at that point that we've already had all of the code working exactly how we want, and then we can just look at the usage patterns and determine what we want to modify for speed purposes. That's a totally separate analysis, and we definitely don't want to be thinking about it now. All right. So the other thing that we know here is that rooms are going to have room specs, because obviously once you need to generate one of these rooms, you're going to have to generate the specification for it somehow, right? Like you're gonna have to access the specification for it somehow. So once we know all this stuff, we can come back here and start to fill some of this in, right? We know that when we create one of these rooms, we are past a spec, so we can fill it out. Similarly with a connection, we can fill it out like so. And what you can see here is when I fill out one of these connection structures, I definitely want to you know, attach these back up. And so let's say we were doing this really basic kind of, probably not the one we eventually want to do, but, you know, let's say that we were doing this. Then what we want to do is have some function of this nature where we add that connection to each room. And then the add connection call, all that would do is it's just going to take the data that we're talking about here and I'm going to sort of make something that creates that secondary list. So I'll create one of these room connections. I know that its next pointer is going to be whatever the room's first connection pointer is, right? Because I'm going to just daisy chain them on there. I know that I will become the new room first connection, right? And I also know that the room con here, its connection is the one that's being passed in, right? So I set the next pointer to whatever the first one was. The first one now becomes me, and then the number done. So this builds up, I believe, our entire sort of structure that we have specified. These things are going to refer to each other. So I'm going to go ahead and start a little forward declaration party up here so that all these people can have pointers to each other because it's that kind of a thing, right? So now all of those are created, and we've got sort of one more obvious thing, like I said, before we even start writing code that we kind of know, which is that we want to be able to lay out these rooms. And of course, we've created all the rooms, but then the world generator doesn't know what the rooms are, right? So we kind of want to have a thing like this, where we can just have all of our rooms listed. And so like I was saying kind of before, we probably want this here as well. So I'll just go ahead and add it. So we can loop over all our connections in all of our rooms when we want to do things like start the layout and we need to figure out where things go or whatever else, right? So there's a couple weirdnesses here, and we'll get to them in a second, but all I want to do now is just kind of make sure that that stuff makes sense. So when we come through here and we make a new room, I want to say that the generator first room equals this room, and of course the room global next equals the first room, right? And that's just daisy chaining these on. The same is true for the connect call. I might call this add room connection. And furthermore, something else we can do here that's kind of nice is we know that our room connections, we know that we may want that to sort of be something we could access. We could put those in here too, and we'll see whether we want to do that, like I said, later, depending on how we want this pointer festival to shake out, right? But anyway, when we do call connect, what we want to do, again, is just say, oops, did I do that right? Yeah, global next equals first room, gen first room, yep. And so gen first connection equals connection, and connection global next equals first connection. So those are all happily linked together, and now we're good to go. All right. So what we need to do now that we pretty much have all of that stuff straightened away is we need to start talking about what's going to happen in these pieces of code. Now, generate world is actually the one I'm going to write first, which takes a world generator that's already had its layout done and goes from there. And the reason for that is the layout code is the code that's actually difficult here. I want to know what it needs to output. And it should be pretty clear what it needs to output. But at the same time, we just need to know, right, enough information about that to sort of get us started. So what I want to do here is say, all right, we're going to do a generate world. And to do the generate world call, all I'm going to do is I'm going to say, I just want to loop over all of the rooms in the world and make them. Because the only thing in the world is rooms. Rooms are connected to each other, and even if we have an outdoor area, it's called a room. and is room-like in that it is surrounded on all sides by either connections to other rooms or trees or mountains that you can't pass. So everything is functionally a room, even if it's not a room in sort of literal sense, it's a room semantically. So in order to do this, I'm just going to say, all right, let's loop over every room there is. And for every room, I just want to make the room, right? I just want to go ahead and make the room. So this is a basically generate room call. And that's just going to say, all right, if I'm given a room, I expect to have some way that I can actually place that room down. Now, in this old style here that we've got, I probably, like I said, I really want this to mostly become reference code. I don't really want any of this stuff to still be happening, probably. So I'm kind of going to stuff it down here. And we'll kind of do a little bit more work with that later on as we go. I'm going to open up 2 views of this file as we go. So here we are in generate room. And I would suspect probably too, this might move out to its own thing. So there might be like world gen and room gen. Because again, world gen is about figuring out where everything goes in the world, and room gen is about filling in individual rooms, and those can probably be separate, right? You know, probably. Hard to say, maybe not, I don't know, but probably. And it depends on how much linkage there is between 2 rooms and, you know, whatever. Anyway. So what I want to do when I generate a room, to start with, I'm just going to do the basic thing. I want to spam down some places to stand for however big the room is, right? And so what I want to do is I want to take some notion of the corners of the room, kind of like we're doing here, where we've got sort of these abs tile values. I want to just sort of slap some stuff down there as a rectangle, right? So what I want to do is something fairly similar to this, only I think I might rewrite it to be more of a min-max sort of a thing. But what I want to do, fundamentally speaking, is basically the same, right? So I want to do something like have a tile Y here. And max tile Y is really the wrong word. I don't know whether we want this to be a less than or equal to or an equal to. It's hard to say. It's a convention thing, and it depends which one is the more convenient for you to work with most of the time. Whether you want to be inclusive of the outer bounds or exclusive of it. Usually the lower bound you're always inclusive of, but you know. And so if we do a basic room generator here, it's going to look something like this. So we know we need those inputs, so that's already kind of telling us what the room has to determine for itself when it gets placed, which we kind of already knew. And when we actually start to go down and put down the floor, and I guess, you know, maybe this is a better name for that, is the floor tile Z. Then when I'm creating the actual floor, then what I can do is just kind of make this stuff be reasonable. So, you know, if we take a look here, we can say, yeah, all this looks relatively straightforward. We don't care about all of this sort of stuff that we had made for creating holes and so on, because at the moment we're not really going to do much of that. We'll sort of look at that a little bit later. This is kind of weird code. Yeah. So you can see here, we don't really want any X and Y offsets at the moment. So we'll probably leave those as they are. This is our sort of height variance. And this is our entity that's actually based on that. And that all looks fine. That just creates an entity and allows you to stand on it, which is fine, right? So once we have this, we are still going to want to do a lot of the stuff we were doing in here, and we'll add that back in slowly. In fact, one of the things that we may want to do is change the way in which this is, we may want to do something more like this. Something more like this, right? And these would be like that. And the reason we might want to do that is because, again, we probably will want to use an array here to store the information about how we place entities in the room, because we may do work with them a little later on. Like, who knows how that's going to work itself out, right? So what we may want to do is something more like that. And then we would have something that looks more like this. And again, it doesn't matter how we set this up. As long as the room gives us something we can compute these by, we're fine. And off we would go. So there's sort of the basic way we would create a room there. And now we have to sort of think about how we might want that room to connect to other rooms. So for the start, what I'm going to do is I'm going to say, anytime we're at the boundary, I am for now just going to fill in that thing, right? So I'm going to say that if the x index equals 0, the x index equals x count minus 1, right? Something like this. So I'll want to be able to say, if we're on the boundary, then I'm probably gonna not have a traversable there, right? So I guess one thing I'm a little hazy on is what the point of the traversable reference is here. I mean, I guess now that I think about it, that's really just for later, right? So really, we don't care about that just yet. That's only if we're going to use it later on. Otherwise, we don't care, right? That's just not relevant at all, actually. Yeah, just not relevant. So what we want to do here is say, all right, look, if it's on the boundary or not, then we're going to have something to say about, and also this, there's no reason this can't just be up here for the moment, or maybe I should say up here. So what I want to do here is just say, okay, let's go ahead and say that if we're on the boundary, then the wall height and the color maybe change. And you don't get a traversable. So we're walling off the entire thing. And that way, when we then go and add connections into the system, we can make sure that we can see, okay, then there's a passageway there that's supposed to be there. That's all. So if we're on the boundary, then the wall height, I don't know, is going to be like 1.5 or something, or 2, who knows. And the color will be something else, just a red for now. Right? So that'll be fine. And I don't know, maybe it should be a lighter red there. Okay. And so now we are mostly okay, except one of the things you can see here about the way we're creating entities, you have to recall we did the entity creation from before in kind of a really haphazard way, right? When we were doing begin grounded entity, you can see how we were doing it here. It was using the world mode creation region nonsense, and it's just kind of dumb, right? And the reason that it's dumb is because we didn't have any world generation code yet. So we were just kind of sticking this in there in whatever way would work at all, right? I mean, there was no rhyme or reason to it whatsoever. And we didn't have any way of knowing or even guessing where this kind of code should live. But now we do, right? So now we know a couple things. First of all, we know that the room is probably, the room by Tommy Wiseau is probably where we want to have the world change stuff happen, right? Because generally speaking, this is where we know the region we're about to update. So we're going to create a bunch of entities and pack them in this one area. That's exactly what we want to do, right? So we know that begin world change probably wants to happen here, right? And that world change is going to return this creation region. And then at the end, when we're done with it, we're going to say, all right, let's end the world change at that time. And that's good, right? That's exactly what we want. Now you can see here, the way this is working too is when we do begin world change, it gathers up an arena. I want to see also what's happening there. That will be interesting to take a look at. We should talk about that a little bit more in a second too. But again, this world change stuff now kind of wants to be, the world change stuff is something that kind of wants to be made systemic to the generation system, because that's where this should have been happening all along. We just didn't have one, right? So we were kind of making do with it. So what I might do here, there's a couple different ways I might approach this, but generally speaking, you can see that this is why I want these to be rewritten, so that in all of this stuff now, instead of taking a world mode, which is not what I want it to do, really wants to take a generator. Now these here, and this is kind of a little bit weird, the brain and the brain IDs and the entity IDs, I feel like those should really be on the world. I'm not sure why they're on the world mode, so I also want to take a look and see if those can be moved into the world itself, because that seems like a more logical place to put those. There maybe is a reason not to do that, I'm not sure, but we'll see. Uh, yeah, so just like looking at this code, right, and all of this stuff here, this stuff can all stay the same, and this stuff can sort of start to be systemic, more systemic compared to what it was as well. Yeah. So I'm going to go ahead and gank that stuff out here. And I'm going to put that in. There we go. And I want all of this stuff to work off of the world like that, and the generation system. I want that out of world mode now. So again, this stuff here looks like most of the things we would want. Let's see. Wait a minute. So here's the world mode last used entity storage ID. So it just uses that for both of these. So yeah, basically this, yeah, I don't see any reason this stuff can't move into the gen at that point. So I would say the world generator is probably the thing that gets the creation region, although it may only be local to the room generation function, in which case it wouldn't really go in here. The last used entity storage index, I feel like should be on the world in the first place. That it just doesn't make a lot of sense to me why it was where it was. So in my mind, that should have been in here, and I can't say I know why it wasn't in here. If I had a good reason for not putting it in here, I would have loved to know when it was. I just can't think of a reason to keep that. I suspect it was just me not having thought it through yet, because it really doesn't sound like the right place to put it. Let's find out. Okay, so when you're doing an add player, I'm going to wait a little bit on, because that has to happen in the middle of gameplay, and that's a slightly different one here. So yeah, for something like begin grounded entity, what I really want to do here is I want to have... I really want this to be something we look at just a little bit later, because since that has to happen in the middle of gameplay, I want to have that handled specially, and we'll see what the best way is to do that. When you do play world here and you initialize the world, reserve brand ID first free, that's pretty easy to initialize when we create the world in the first place. So I feel like that just works. Yeah, all of these can just be... And I really think, since that's the thing that stores all the entities, I really just feel like that's where it should have been the whole time. Anyway, even before we added the generation system, that seems like the more correct place for that. And I'm just kind of looking through this here. You know, also this stuff looks to me like I might want to clean this up a little bit too. Again, because all of this code was really just placeholder. And now that we're kind of seeing how it works, I think there's a lot of things we might want to change. You can see how this code wants to work. We just need to know where we're going to actually put it in terms of sim regions. The sim region, of course, has the world in it itself. It just stores that piece of information. It doesn't need to, you know, we could always pass it in, but just happens to know what it is. So really, when you do begin entity, that really could have just been a sim region call. That's what probably should have happened. And that would just, you know, make the entity. When you're done with it, again, the fact that that was off the world mode, I think, again, this was just for convenience when we were doing it. Now that, you know, we're kind of going through it with an eye towards actually making it correct, I don't think any of this stuff makes any sense, right? Yeah, I mean, all this is all just nonsense. I think this was a several series of things. We actually got it down to a pretty good way of doing it, actually. But we had never finished quite simplifying it down as far as we could have, right? Because you can kind of see here, once I actually do this, you can see how straightforward it actually becomes. Really, you just always have a sim region that you create things inside of. If you don't have one, you just pop one open, but you don't need the world mode for anything. So the fact that it was ever there is kind of silly in the first place. Grounded entity isn't any different from any other entity anymore. So really, we just have begin entity is the only actual thing that we have in the first place. And we don't even need an arena. Like, there is no arena here. So the fact that we actually use that in the first place isn't necessary either, because whatever the sim regions arena was at the time is fine. So yeah. Yeah. So anyway, in our begin entity, end entity stuff here, I think that's all we really needed to do. The chunk position for tile position already worked off of a world anyway, so that doesn't really need to change. And the rest of this stuff, I think, just works. So when we go to do something like add Monstar, let's verify that this actually can work off of just a region. I believe that's the case. This is just a begin entity call, like so. The rest of this stuff is all off of the world anyway, which we have. We could actually have add brain work off of a region as well, because either one of those is fine. But you can see how simple this actually is, right? Now that it's kind of and I'm happy. Like, it's cool that we got it down to such a simple system actually at the end of the day. So good on us for following that through, I think. So taking a look at this stuff again, like, I think this allocate brain and allocate entity ID part of things, they're both calling the same thing there, right? So I think we can just make versions of these. That just do the same. They all do the same thing, right? So this stuff is basically pulled out at that point. It goes into, right, I mean, it's actually stuff that happens in here, right? So the world has the ability to add these things to it. The sim region has thunks, right? In there that really aren't doing anything. They're just so you don't have to type region world if you don't want to. And from then on, you just get, it's just really simple. I mean, it's so basic that you know, that just looks great. I mean, I'm totally happy with that, and off you go. So basically, everything everyone does from now on just takes a sim region. That's how it constructs things, and it just assumes that someone upstream at some point opened a region for editing, and then it's going to edit in that region, and everything just works. And that seems great. I'm pretty happy with that. That's pretty good. So the other thing that I would say here is I feel like end entity. So one of the things is we have this concept of end entity because we used to have this kind of crappy system where the entities had to be built in a specific way or whatever. We don't have an end entity anymore, right? So we don't need to call that. End entity is just set entity position, right? That's all it is. So it's really just place entity. And begin entity is really just add entity. We don't have, because of the nice way that the sim region works now, we don't have to do begin and end entity. Entities can just stay in a state of hybrid, like haven't really been finished yet, until the whole sim region is packed. And that's also great. Like, all of these things are awesome, in my opinion. Like, this is turning out to be pretty baller at the end of the day. And that's pretty good. That's what you want to have happen when you do a bunch of work to sort of like look at and explore solutions. You want them to come together at the end, and it is sort of doing that, right? So now these are much more clear. You just add the entity and you can do whatever you want to it. You can work on it later, return it to somebody else who could work on it separately. You don't have to have a finalization point to it because the whole room just gets packed up together when it's all done. And that is way better, right? That's like way, way better in my opinion. So that's great. And all of that works pretty cool. So then I think we're getting into a reasonable space here. So when we come in here, we just do an add entity call to add the entity. We then do whatever we want to it, and we can do our place entity call here. And that's it. And off we go. Let me just finish porting some of these guys for the changes that we made. All right. So fundamentally speaking, now what we want to do is we want to open up a part of the world for editing. And that part of the world that we want to edit is going to be bounded by the region of the room that we want to use. So that's what I'm going to do in there. And then when we end, we finish, and I don't even know. You know, I'll be completely honest with you. I don't even know what's supposedly happening here. That doesn't really make any sense. Why would you pass the world to something that already has the world in it? Do we know the answer to that question? I mean, so if we have begin world change and we copy the world in at the outset, is there ever a reason why we would not just use the one that's there? I mean, the answer is obviously no. Right? Isn't it? I mean, is there a way in which that flow happens different? I mean, don't you have to have the world at the outset? And you can't switch one world for another world in the middle of the update unless that's something. And if you did, why wouldn't you just patch the pointer? Right? So I feel like that's just, that's fake news, right? So I feel like we want to just get rid of that because it's not necessary. Okay. We'll deal with where we want to get the random series from a little bit later. But I think that's all pretty good now. So this is great. I am really happy about that, actually. And I'm even going to go a little bit further and spread this out a little bit more. We have Handmade World Gen. I'm going to make Handmade Room Gen. And the reason for that is I want to be able to look at these pieces of code in collections. As a side note, oh my god, GNOME 3 drives me nuts. Like, every time it repaints the screen, it flickers like the windows that have a translucent backdrop. They flicker. And it's horrible. Absolutely horrible. I wish they would fix that. I don't even know what they're doing to make that happen. It's pretty spectacular. I wonder if there's a way to like turn that stuff off. Maybe I can do it. It's like all terminal windows just flicker, and they flicker like crazy in this corner of my eye. It's nuts. Drives me insane. Yeah, let's see. Command colors. Transparency. None. Will that work? Find out. Hey, yes. Should have done that a long time ago. All right, so basically just making two different files here, and what I want to do is I just want to store the stuff that creates like the entities and stuff like that. I want those to be a little bit more, yeah, I just want to keep separate the stuff that's just for making, because there's going to be so much of it, the stuff for making entities and all that stuff, I want to just put that in a separate place. So don't have to think about it, right? Or look at it while I'm working on the other stuff. So basically, once you get to the point where you call generate room, I want to be in this file, and this is just all the stuff that does room generation. And when you're generating the layout for the whole world, you're in this file, right? And that just helps me keep them straight. A lot of times people have asked me, like, how do I organize my files? The answer is any way you darn well please. And for me, what I like is I like files to be broken down by sort of the thing that they're doing, not by class or some object-oriented thing or whatever else. I want them to be like, okay, all the stuff that lays out the world goes in this file. All the stuff that lays out a room goes in this file, right? And that could be 30 structs or 1 struct or 500 routines if necessary, as long as it all feels like it belongs there and I'm working on that code together. I typically put that in a file. When I sense a very clear division of labor between two things, then I, will sort of separate those out. So anyway, now what we have to do is, well, I guess besides including these files. So what I need to do now is I need to go ahead and, looks like that tile size in meters as well. Let me just, pop these out here. We need to kind of figure out what we want to do about this eventually, but at the moment it's fine. So the only thing I need to do is just pop this forward declaration out here, because that's the only place that it gets called into. So it just says, hey, well, that's all you do. That whole file's job is just to generate a room. That's all it does. So as long as we got that call, we're good. So now all we have to do is take a look at how this room gen's actually going to work. At the moment, I want to just clean this up a little bit, and then we're going to move over to the more pressing problem, which is how do we place a person after the fact? Because again, we do have one case where we add entities already outside of world generation, which is when a new hero enters the game, right? Like if someone hits the start button on a controller or something. And there'll be more of that later, because we may want to add entities for, like, someone throws a projectile or something. We may want to add an entity there. So, excuse me. We definitely have some work we want to do in the future in that, so that has to do with that, right? And so we're going to go look at that in a second. In the meantime, what I'd like to do is in the generation system, when we're actually doing stuff like generating a room, what I'd like to do is, in addition to the memory arena we use for permanent storage, I'd like to do a little memory arena for change-based storage here. So something like this. And what I want to do is, or maybe I could call this temp memory. So what I want to do here is when we go to use that temp memory there, that's used for this change region stuff, and that gets nerfed at the end of it, right? So after the temp memory, down here, we just say, okay, free or end temporary memory. And that way, we don't really care how much memory that takes or what it needs to do. It just does its thing and off it goes. We already have the world. So what we need to know now is what happens in these two places. I'd also like to just go ahead in here and make sure that all that stuff is what I think it is. So you can see here that we pass in a time value. We're going to be passing 0 there still because we don't have anything to say about that. We pass in an origin and a boundary. So what we can do there is we know what our origin is going to be when we're creating the world. We know it's going to be the center of the room. So what we can really do here is just say, okay, our center is just going to be the min tile x plus, 0.5, or I should say x count divided by 2. And this is going to be win tile y. And we know the center can just be the floor tile z, right? So we know a room center, and it's not necessarily the exact center, right? We could try to get the exact center, but we really probably don't care. And then our rectangle for rect center dim, we know that the center is just going to be 0, 0, 0 because it's just we're passing a rectangle that's used relative to the center, I believe. So we know we're just centered around that. And then we know we are, you know, x count, y count, and some notion of z count. What we would like to do is just get a relatively large region around the room center that we're going to be working on, and we'll pull in anything that's roughly in that area. And so what we want to do is say that the tile side, there we go, in meters multiplies these two, and the tile depth in meters multiplies this one, right? And I should probably do that. Something like this. And that just gives us a little bit of an understanding of what's going on there in terms of the, you know, the bounds of the thing. So we want this to be expanded a bit. So what I would also say is I'd like to grab tiles on either side. So let's say that we have an apron, you know, or something like this. You know, that just tries to grab enough around it so that those extra elements will all be pulled in. So we have some kind of ability to query what's nearby in the room and other stuff like that, right? So I'm gonna, instead of calling these room, because they're not really that, I'm just gonna call these like change rectangle and change center. And I think that's most of what I want there. Tile depth in meters. Where is that defined? So it's this. Chunk dim in meters. Looks like. Yeah. I feel like, again, that stuff's a little bit loosey-goosey, so I'm going to go ahead and say 2. And say we want to finally get this stuff locked down, because in the generator is the time to finally do all that, because this is the thing that actually builds the world for real. So we should probably do that. But for the moment, we do know the answer to that question. It's that. And that's fine. So now we've got the series here. And the generator should have that series in it. And it does not yet. So probably that's just on the world, right? Though? In fact, it because we have the world entropy. It's right here. So really, what we want to do is grab this probably at the outset and just say that the random series that we're going to use here is going to be whatever the game entropy is. Okay. We need that information to come from the room, and then we are needing to close our parentheses, and okay. And that's about it. So if we assume that these things come from somewhere at some point, I don't know exactly, like I said, how we want to have those work in the room or what's going on there exactly. For the time being, I guess I'll just say, hey, look, maybe this looks like that, and maybe these come from here. Because for the time being, since that's what I know the input to the system is, you might as well get them directly. And then later on, we can find out what actually we should get from there to compute these values, which may be something else entirely. So now we're back to the problem from before, however, which is that we still do want the ability to do a limited amount of modification of the world here in the world mode, and that is specifically when we want to create, oops, that's not good, specifically when we want to create something like a player entity. And so when we call add player, we are implicitly here wanting to make a modification. What we can do now is get rid of this nonsense here because that stuff is irrelevant to us and was kind of a hack in the first place. And so now what we can do is actually just call these directly on the sim region, which is what we wanted to do in the first place. And again, that makes this even cleaner and much more pleasant. Now, the generation code needs to expose that code, like the add entity stuff and whatever. I don't know if maybe this should now be part of the world or part of the entity. I'm not sure. I don't care, so I'm just going to put it up here for now. And we can worry about where we want to organize that later if for some reason it becomes an issue. So I'm just going to say that this stuff is going to come out here and sort of have a set of specifications. We can move it somewhere else later if I care, when I care. Oops. Gotta love the whole forward declarations required in C nonsense. All the changes to the spec and 8 billion things that the C++ community added, they never got rid of the need to forward declare. It's absolutely bonkers. All right. So let's see here. Shadow Alpha is, how often do we use this? Well, we'll just put it up here for now. So, place entity should be out here. There we go. And I think we're good now. All right. That should do it. There we go. And now I think we've sort of gotten all of our ducks in a row. Egg ducklings, our duck eggs in a row. Our broccoli in a row. So what I'm going to do now is, again, just try to get our game back up into a running state. Since obviously we don't have a bunch of stuff that we're saying we need to have. How much time do I have? I've got like 35 minutes, I think, something like that. So what I want to do now is I want to go through and say, okay, let's take a look at how we could make our generation code just generate some rooms that are totally wrong, that don't do any of the things we asked them to do, but that's fine, and then get the game running in that state, and then start working on the layout algorithm portion of the system. right? Step by step. So now what I want to do in here inside the world gen system is I want to go ahead and have some nominal way that layout does something, right? It's not going to do what we want it to do, but it will do something. And so what it's going to do is it's going to do the dumbest possible room layout algorithm you could possibly have that doesn't satisfy any of the constraints that we asked for. But again, we don't care yet. What I'm going to do is just step through each of the rooms and just give them a grid. Like, I'm just going to stamp them down, right? I'm just going to stamp down the rooms completely irrespective of where I said they should go. So this is not useful to us, but again, it helps us get a little baby step, by baby step. So I know that these are all the things I needed to fill out in the room structure, right? I know I need each of these. And so I'm just going to set them. And each of these is going to be something. Let's say I should probably just make a pointer to that off of the gen, but we'll think about that later. So if I make a random between, let's say it's got to be at least 8 wide, it can be up to 16 wide. It could be between like 6 tall and 9 tall or something. And it's 1 high, just cause, right? Yeah, so, let's say do something like that. And then in here I just have a tile X, tile Y, tile Z. And I don't know what these are going to be, but, they're like 10,000 or something. What did we start them with before? Does anyone remember? Oh, so did we do... Oh, we did all these with S32s before? Oh. Well, never mind. Forget everything I just said. But is that actually the case? Yeah, I guess it always is the case. All right, well, great. Then we just start at 0, and it makes some sense. All right. Well, forget all that. Doesn't matter. Easy peasy. Lemon squeezy. Everything's fine. So let's just go ahead and do that then. And let that be, as the Beatles famously said. And yeah, all of this stuff can just not care about that at all. And I think that's that. So when I create these here, what I want to do is I'm just going to line them up. So I'm just going to say tile x plus equals room x count here, and then all our rooms are just lined up in a row laterally. That's all they're going to do, right? Not particularly exciting. Looks like this needs the world struct. So I'm going to make it take that. And I think that actually does our world creation. Now, one of the problems that we're then going to have is we don't have any camera set up. So I'm going to try and get that set up. You can see here that that happens in this piece of code. And so I'm going to try and make that occur as well. Now, in the future, we're going to want to actually have some information about where the camera should actually be. And so maybe I'm going to like start us down that path a little bit. So you can see here where we've got our camera P and we say like, okay, hey, the camera location should be whatever this new camera position is. I don't know how we exactly want to sort of send that back out. But I think that's just going to be something we're going to want to report, right? Like we're just going to want to kick that back to the world mode. So, you know, maybe more properly something like this. Where we just need this creation to kick us back to something we can use to figure out where we should start looking, right? And I think that's really all we will need. I hope. Yeah, should be. So what I want to do there is just have like something like this. So when we do our generation, we're probably going to get back a bunch of stuff, probably. But one of the main things we'll get back is the initial camera location. So when we call create world here, what I want to do is, send back this initial camera location. And then that's something that can be used outside to set world mode stuff, or it doesn't really matter, anything you want, right? And so I think all of that is pretty much done. Furthermore, the transient state, actually, now that I look at it, that arena coming in is really, we could just use that for our memory. Because everything in here that happens on that transient state could, yeah, so we could actually just feed into that if we want to. So we kind of have the option of doing mostly that, but we don't have to do that at the moment. So inside here where we're doing our create world stuff, everything can just happen. After we're done generating the world, we need to have some idea of where the camera should start out. At the moment, we kind of know someplace we could put it. So I'm just going to cold put it there. Let's say that we're just going to put it at, 440 or something like that. But in the future, we are going to actually have a way for the generator to say where that is, because we're going to want to place the camera somewhere specific. So we'll do that. But I wanted to kind of get the flow correct here. And so that's why I sort of started out with this as being, as there being a conduit for the camera position. So it makes a little bit more sense. So results. Initial camera P, this is probably, oops, probably should look more like that. That should look like that. Don't ask me why I didn't just type this in the first place, but, I didn't. So let's just take a look at that, and we'll start stepping through that and try to get that working to create something we can actually see and hop around on, right? So, because like I said, I don't really know. I gotta go. One of our reasons for doing this is to sort of get the camera code finalized as well. So that camera code, I'm not sure how stable that stuff is anyway, or if that's even right. So we're gonna have to play around with a little bit of that stuff anyway, and figure it out. But for now, let's just go figure out whether we're creating our rooms at all and whether they're in places that make any sense or any of that stuff. And then we'll sort of work our way up from there. So going into the world gen, I'm going to jump right to the end so I can see what sorts of stuff we're telling the game we want to do, right? Oops. All right. So those look like sane values, right? And when we come down into here, our change center looks pretty reasonable to me. Our change rectangle also looks pretty reasonable to me. We begin our world change, and we start making a bunch of entities. And we place those entities in some places. Those places seem pretty reasonable to me. And there are interiors as well as boundaries, so that's good. So it looks like we have added what we wanted to add, right? Now, what I don't know is if any of that stuff's getting packed back correctly, I suppose, so I should also just double check that that's occurring here, right? So, I mean, it looks pretty reasonable. So I would say that it looks like our basic world generation stuff seems to be working okay. I don't know what the initial camera P value is, but I assume it's reasonable. It looks fairly reasonable. And so then we pop back out here, and we set the initial camera stuff. I don't know if there's anything else that we're not setting. doesn't look like it, so I think we're good. So once we come out here and we have a new world that's been created, I'm not really sure I remember the add player stuff being a little bit nasty because it kind of has to check for joining players as a separate pass because the first player is kind of special, right? But, you know, whatever. So when we actually take a look at what the world position is of this guy here, again, that's a pretty reasonable location. That's, I think, where we would expect that person to be added, in fact. Let's take a look at update camera. So I guess one problem that we do have here, and you can kind of see it, is this code is kind of stupid. But it does remind us we have to create our camera information entities. Otherwise, the camera doesn't know what to do. So I suppose we should add that, because since we're not really updating that code just yet, let's just add that in there as well. So inside room gen, what I'm talking about here is this stuff. So we want to make a entity for the room that just says kind of what the camera state of this thing is, right? So it's just that. And I guess it's at the center. So it's at these. Yeah. So none of this stuff really cares about we're sort of in this situation of we like to talk about tiles because it helps us with the world generation, but none of this stuff cares about tiles. It would be nice to stop dealing with that. So I think that might be something that I want to start doing next time. Sort of transform out of that pretty early. But whatever. We'll get there when we get there. So that's fine and dandy. And again, this has to be the center, which we kind of already wanted to know. Well, actually, it's just this. I mean, we already have it, so I'm just going to pass it. It's just not quite correct. And I think, let's see here. So that just wants to know like the width and the height and so on. So I mean that's just this. I don't know what necessarily goes there. All right, moving on. Okay. So we're getting further. However, although our rooms are properly stacked up, for some reason I'm not seeing the entities that make up the actual ground. So almost there, but not quite. So we're not. This stuff seems a little bit broken for some reason, but I'm not sure why. But I think that's all we've got to fix now. How it worked to have a traversable, but not where you couldn't actually see the ground pieces, I'm not sure. But then again, we did make a lot of changes, so you know, maybe that makes sense. Okay, so anyway, I want to check out the add piece. Let me do again a little bit of a, just take a little bit of a gander at this here. Because all of these cubes should have gotten added. They should be relatively reasonable. I don't see any other weird things here, unless floor tile Z is somehow borked there, which it, you know, it could be. So, I guess one thing that's a little weird, let me just go ahead and make sure that I don't have some other interceding oddity here. I want to make sure that we're grabbing, you know, sensible area, or that we're looking at reasonable areas as far as the sim region is concerned. Yeah, that's what I feared. So it looks like the sim region is not in this area. So we're still a little bit borked just with our startup. So what I was trying to do there, right, is I was just trying to see what the world bounds were. And in fact, I can do a push volume outline here if I wanted to. I probably should in the future. But if I look at the world sim bounds, I'm not seeing them. So as far as this is concerned here, we're definitely getting Ah, so this is our problem here, right? Our region that we are trying to pull in is never defined, right? Because again, this is stuff that kind of was just hacked in there because we didn't have a world generator, so we didn't really have any idea about how we wanted to do any of these things. So it kind of just sits there and does its thing. But what you can see is in the code that we commented out, right, there's standard room dimension is getting set here. And if we don't set that, then we're never going to be able to see anything happen because nothing's going to get pulled in the same region. I don't think we want it to work that way, right, in the future. There's a lot of reasons we wouldn't. I'm going to go ahead and switch this over to optimized build so we can play it a little. Well, play it is perhaps an incorrect term at this point. So what you can see here, right, is the hero is now confined to essentially a pen, right? And can't go outside of it. And of course, the reason that the hero can't go outside of the pen is because we don't have any respect for the connections between rooms, right? Like I was talking about before. And that's to be expected. So when we look now, we've got, you can see the other rooms out there. And we would like to be able to go, we'd like to be able to get from room to room in some way, but we of course can't. And that's fine. So I think we've essentially finished all of the stuff that I had wanted to finish in terms of getting the basic room layout stuff and cleaning up the way that we create anything. That actually looks pretty good. I don't think we have time to really do anything else right now before we end up moving to the next, before the episode would end. We only have 10 minutes left, and that's not really enough time to do anything as far as getting the actual layout stuff to work. Now, what I can do potentially is maybe get doors working a little bit. I'm not sure. So I can do something that has to do with doors. I'll put it to you that way. I could do a little bit of work on the doors. I just can't finish the actual real layout stuff because that's going to be like probably all next weekend getting a basic one of those working, right? So now if what I want to do here is just have there be a way to make doors, well now, and hopefully you can see already even just early on here, how this starts to take shape. Before we kind of just had this haphazard way of slapping down some test stuff. Well, now when we call generate room, well, when I go to generate the room, if I want to make a door, I actually have some way of knowing what I might make for a door because a room has a list of connections to other rooms in it. And we can imagine that list of connections actually having some, carrying some weight so that it knows where those connections might be. So for example, if I was to go to the world gen code and say that a gen connection, which is a connection from one room to another connection, actually has a piece of information in it that says where that connection is spatially, then I can actually, I know what to put there when I'm looking at the other room. So for example, in here, what I could say is, this connection has maybe a boundary to it. Let's do something very simple in that regard. Let's say that we're going to make something like a gen volume, which maybe is one of these things. Something like this. I don't know. And again, I don't really know how we want to store that. But let's say we have one of those. So a room has a volume, and that volume, we can we can use more directly. There we go. All right. So what I want to do now is basically have a knockout volume. So I want to be able to say that if a room has a connection to another room, maybe that connection also has a volume. And if you're inside that volume, then I don't want to actually put any walls there, right? So on boundary is going to be this, but if you're inside any of the other connections, then we're just going to forget about it, right? Something like that, right? Alternatively, what I could do is say if I'm on a boundary and not on a connection, because maybe I want to know that or something, and I don't know, whatever, it doesn't matter. So what I want to do here is say, all right, when I'm going to create this thing, I'm going to go ahead and do something like this, where I say, all right, I've got an x index, a y index, and whatever, right? And I want to know whether or not that's inside some volume that I've got here. So I have whatever the connection is that I'm looking at. I want to basically say, like, am I inside that connection volume, whatever it is? And then here, what I can do is I can loop over all the connections for this room. So I can say, all right, there's a gen room connection. And that's just going to be equal to the room's first connection. And then I'm just going to loop over those. And off I go, right? So now you can kind of see how we can link rooms up. Once we create a connection, we just say where that connection is between the two rooms, and then it will not put something there. All we need is a query that will tell us whether or not we're inside one of these things. Not very difficult to write, as you might imagine. If I have one of these gen volume structures, and then I have an x, a y, and a z, then I know that all I have to do is say that the result is going to be if the x is greater than or equal to the x of the volume, and the x is less than the volume plus, plus the x count, right? If all of my range checks succeed on each axis, then I know I'm inside the volume, and off we go. So that's all fine. At this point, those volumes will be null, so nothing should happen when I run this, right? It'll just create the same rooms that it created before, and we're fine. If, however, I was to just hard code when we create a connection, like I said, we don't actually know where the connection is going yet, but if I was to hard code some of those in the world generator, so in here, when it calls the layout and it's putting these things in there, if I was to take the connections for the room or something like that and hard code them to something, I could make these daisy chain together. And the way that I do that is just like, all right, you know, like I said, we just hard code them. So maybe when I go over this room, I just loop over the connections in here. Something like this. And in fact, I could do it more like this. And then what I'll do is just say, like, okay, let's suppose that the room connection in this case is actually, you know what? I don't even need to do this since we're just hacking. I'll look at the first one. If this room does have a connection, then I'll just set it to be for its volume to be to the left and encompassing 2 blocks, let's say. And that should create some connections between the rooms. Again, we're totally hacking this. It's dumb, but that's just what we're going to do, right? So the connection volume in this case is going to be it's going to be 1 high on the Z count. It's going to have an X count of 2. It's going to have a Y count of 2, right? It's going to knock out, let's say, a 2 wide square. And it's going to be on the tile X boundary -1, so it's back 1 from that. It's going to be at the tile Y center, so it would be halfway. And the Z is just the tile Z. And so that should just set some arbitrary connection crap in there. And hopefully we'll start to see some knockouts there. So almost, but not quite. You know what? Did I... I'm not sure why that wouldn't have knocked out a bit more. I may have a bug in there, but we'll see. It's very strange. It like knocks it out for this room 3 up. That's really strange. Well, I will hold off on debugging till next time. Again, that's just hacking that in there, so I don't... It's a problem because the 2 rooms will fight over where that connection volume actually is, right? And so it's one of those things that this hack is, yeah, that could be explained by just the way that I'm hacking it in there. Might be enough to see why it doesn't actually work, right? But it could actually be something more subtle than that, so, you know, it's hard to say. We will find out when the time comes. So, yeah, but otherwise... Yeah, otherwise I would have assumed that it would have been okay. I would like to do one thing here, which is just to say that I want to color the region so I can see it a little bit better. So I'm going to do something like that. So I can just see which regions are getting color knocked out. Yeah, you can kind of see this is busted. So I've got something wrong with the way I'm doing it. Oh. Huh. Yeah, you think? I was testing the relative index. That ain't gonna cut it, my friends. We need to test the absolute index, obviously, for lack of a better term. All right. So yeah, you can see that this works pretty well now, except we kind of have this nasty problem where like we don't know. So this won't daisy chain all the rooms together because some rooms only have one connection, right? These rooms are supposed to be laid out in a topology, and so a room that only has one connection can only have one open thing, but it looks like it worked just fine, right? So all we really need to do now next time is actually make some layout that makes any sense at all, and these will now be a little world you can explore. It doesn't have anything in it, but first things first. So that's all good, and yeah, and I think even the camera is sort of working now as well, right? So that's fun too. Anyway, yeah, little by little, all good. You can see again. Also now we can fix the lighting, so we can slide the lighting over too, which will be nice, as well. So yeah, it's getting good. I think we're in good shape here. I'll go ahead and go to a brief Q&A. Can you please fix end world gen? Yes. Although I don't know what's wrong with it at the moment. What do you want me to fix about end world gen? Just clear the temp arena, the temp memory. I think that's already taken care of, the fact that it's only ever begin and end temp, so it's not really necessary, but... Oh, the capitalization. Yes. What is internal used for in C? Is it like the opposite of extern in C++? Yes, sort of. It's not actually, that is what it is, but it's not actually C. It's really just us. So you can see here, I basically got internal defined as static. The reason is because static is like the worst keyword in the world. It means like 50 different things, and it's just like you can't search for it because it'll hit all of the different uses of it and so on. So I define internal to be static, so I see the difference between that and like when I'm defining a variable as static. Or worse yet, a static member function in C++, right? Which is a completely, again, different use of it. One of the things they did in C++, I think is actually a really awful idea, is they wanted to minimize the degree to which they added new keywords. And that was just dumb. Should the light calculation always be stuck to the camera? Yes, it should be. And basically what we want to do is just animate it smoothly. So right now what happens is we animate it to snap to the new location the camera will be, but instead what we want to do is have it actually track where the camera is, just period, right? And that's easy to do, right? It's not hard, but we just haven't done it yet. No questions? By the way, in some C++ header, there is a definition of internal, so your code would not work if any C++ file gets included. I'm happy with that. It prevents us from getting mad. Yes, I totally agree. Anything I can put in my code that prevents anyone from ever including a C++ header in it is a win. In fact, if there was just something you could put in the code that says don't ever allow anyone to include a C++ library header in here, I would put that in all of my code. What function is the camera using to interpolate between two positions right now? I don't remember what we're using. I don't think we're using anything particularly sane, actually. To be completely honest with you. Yeah, this is just garbage. So to answer your question, it's actually just doing it's a non-stable iteration, right? It's just like a taking the delta and adding a time fraction to it. So it's basically a frame rate dependent ordinary differential equation, right? Which is not what we would want it to be in the end. If that makes sense. In fact, I can put one here for you. So. How much of the world gen can be done in this pass, and how much would depend on more gameplay exploration stuff? Well, probably the world gen like backbone is what we're making now, so that we can make a world that we can then play through. But the vast majority of gen stuff will kind of just be code that starts accreting as we add gameplay features. Obviously, we would not want to well, you know what? I see that Jonathan Blow has arrived in the stream. So here's what I'll say. As I've said many times, many times on the stream, I'm not a game designer, so I don't know. All I can tell you is the game designers who I respect, like John, like Daniel Ben-Mergui, like they say you have to kind of design forward where you explore the game space yourself and find out what's interesting about it and then think about ways you can construct meaningful interactions based around those experiences. So I would assume that the correct answer to your question, based on what they have said, is that we only are doing just enough to build a world, and then every other thing we do with world generation should be based on something we experience in the game, right? So we make the little orphanage and the forest pieces, like I'm doing now, and then we put some monsters in there, and when we fight the monsters, we go, oh, it would feel good here if I had to plan about some timer that was counting down or something, right? So then I go and add the counter to the world gen, right? That is how every game designer I've ever thought was any good has always said you're supposed to do that kind of work. So I would just assume that's the right answer, but if you actually want to know the right answer, you would need to ask them. So maybe John's going to stream today. I don't know. I think he's actually not home in San Francisco, so maybe not. But next time he's on stream, you should ask him for a more complete answer, because that's really, you want to get that kind of answer from a game designer, not an engine programmer. Why does the color of the room go as it does without lighting rather than going black? Because we actually always have moonlight. So if you remember inside the lighting code, there's the moon, and when you don't hit a light, you get moon if it's up, right? There's a moon default value here. So let me show you how that happens. So you see this line of code. So basically, if I was to take out the moonlight, it would become black. So basically, if we look at how the lighting is working here, you can see that as I move around, there's sort of a baseline moonlight color that it goes to there. If instead what I did was inside this code, I just said, yeah, that's not going to happen. Then what you would see is those regions become completely black because no light is reaching them whatsoever, or maybe not no light. You can see there's a little bit of light reaching them as the fall off from this light gets lower out there, but that's what's happening. So I don't know if that helps make sense, but basically there is a large sky lit sort of inflow of light that makes it so nothing is completely black. Unless it's got like a sealed roof over it or something. Just want to randomly suggest transactional processing as a topic for some future off-topic stream. Okay. Will there be specific locations in the world? I saw you mention orphanage yesterday, and if so, how will they be handled in a generated world? Everything will be generated, but you saw how the orphanage stuff was sort of going. Basically what we'll have is we'll have special purpose routines designed to create them in some less than completely generative way, right? So some things about them are prescribed. But that's true of everything, right? Like a dungeon has a bunch of prescriptions to it, right? Naysayer88, how long would it take me to get up to speed on 4Coder if I decide to switch off the hell that is Emacs? No time at all. Like basically you could start with, all right, so here's what I'd say, John. If you want an exact Emacs clone, one of the problems is I don't know if anyone's actually redone the key bindings to be Emacs-like yet. I was just having too many RSI issues with holding down the control key, so I switched to a modal-like version that's the same as my Emacs boundings were, but with modality. So if you started with my Emacs config, it'd be pretty far from what you're used to using right now, and that might take a while to get up to speed. Somebody else may have done a closer binding to Emacs-like keys, but that would be the real learning curve there. What I can say is just using 4Coder, if you're willing to spend a day doing some programming, is actually pretty easy because all of the programming happens in C. You don't have to learn something like Emacs Lisp. So for example, if you want to look at what I've got, Handmade, MISC, 4Coder Casey, if you want to look at how it works, it's pretty straightforward. I've made tons of customizations to it, but the basic idea is pretty simple. You just have one entry point, and that entry point does some pretty basic stuff. Like you can see here where I bind all these keys. These are just functions, and you can just specify your own functions that should happen here. There's a default one that you could look at that has a bunch of stuff, but like I have customized almost everything. But this is all it is. You just bind all your keys here to functions that you call, and those functions can do whatever you want them to do. There's defaults for almost everything that Emacs does, but I also have my own like special sauce there, right? Then you've got the same kind of things you're used to in Emacs, like, oh, if you just want to call a C function when a file gets opened, you just set it. And then you can do whatever you want in there and whatever. You can obviously have mine, which has a bunch of this stuff in it. And you can see like, because I do modal keys, I made a macro for having two different modes be bound in either way. And all that is just a thing that says, hey, am I in edit mode or am I not? And it just does one code or the other in either case. So what you can see here is there's a lot of things that are actually just built in, like reverse search, undo, go to line. Those are all built in. I didn't write those. So a lot of the things, if you were to just cut and paste all of this stuff, write character, blah, 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 all of that stuff, if you actually do bind keys, you can bind, if you don't want modal like I have, you can bind all of your keys right there and just be done. And you wouldn't even need any like C code at all, right? But yeah, like I say, I like to really heavily customize my editors. You can see I've written all kinds of stuff here. here's a thing that loads my to-do list. Here's a thing that searches for where I want my build to occur. Here's a thing that like looks for if like I know that I want like C's to load H's with a, if I hit the C key, you know, all kinds of crap, right? And so I've done a lot of customizations. So it kind of depends on how much you want to do customization wise. All of that stuff, you can sort of just start with mine if you want, and then change all the key bindings. Or you can start with Alan's. He ships a default one, and that all the C file for that is included if you are using 4Coder. So you can start with that. I don't know. So I can't really answer that question for you because I don't know your Emacs config very well. Hopefully it wouldn't be that hard for you to just go in there and rebind the keys. The only thing that's going to be nasty for you is that there isn't a syntax highlighting system for JAI, which maybe you need. You can talk to Alan about that. I don't know if he can help you. I know that down the line they're going to be adding more in the ways of customizable parsing and stuff like that. But at the moment, you know, it's an editor for C-like languages, and JAI might not quite be C-like enough for the parser to correctly like indent and stuff like that, you know? Obviously, if you want to switch over to 4Coder and you have any trouble with it, just let me know and I can help you get your config working. But like just starting with my config should be pretty easy because you can just change all the key bindings to the actual key bindings you want, and don't bother with these modal, like don't bother, just put the actual function in here that you want, and then you could have a non-modal binding pretty quickly, right? By just starting with mine and putting what you want in here instead of in this weird modal macro crap I made, which is just because I was making some modal stuff, right? Is there a reason you don't use force inline? Yeah, mostly because I just haven't had a case where I really wanted to yet. You know, the compiler does a pretty reasonable job of picking what to inline and what to not most of the time. So the only time I would really use force inline is if I actually am optimizing a piece of code and literally saw a place where I wanted the compiler to inline and it wasn't, then I would use force inline. But the whole, like, I always know better than the compiler when to inline thing, I don't think is true, because if I haven't looked at the performance of something, I'm not in a position to tell it what to inline and what not to, really, right? It's doing some analysis. That analysis isn't great. It's better than no analysis, and no analysis is what I would be doing if I was putting force inline in places willy-nilly, right? Can you go over the architecture, how to generate the rooms, like with this generic config briefly again? Yes, but I'm not sure what you mean, because we haven't implemented the layout stuff yet. So all we're doing is we're creating a record of the rooms we want to generate. We're creating records of how they're connected. And then we, in the future, will implement a layout function that obeys those connections and places rooms so that they are non-overlapping and are connected in the way that is requested. Then we, once have that layout, we go through each room and actually put down the entities that comprise the room. That's all we're doing. John says streaming today would be very doubtful. All right, well, you know, some other time. Neil said, I think they meant the unlit part. Oh, you mean when we're in the debug view, you mean why does this look like that? The reason for that is just that the lighting system only looks at things in a region, and if the lighting system isn't looking at something, it just gets what its reflective color would be. Like what, yeah, as you said, diffuse albedo. coming here. Can you start optimizing your code as you go or when you reach major milestones, or do you need to wait for near completion to optimize your code and make sure you don't have useless coding lines bulking up? So I guess what I would say is the answer to that question is actually that you need to sort of develop very good programming skills before you can really answer it effectively yourself, because it depends. The notion that premature optimization is the root of all evil, which is kind of a misquote from Knuth, or a misapplication from Knuth that kind of got distorted down the line to basically mean don't optimize your code until you have to or something, right? It's not entirely true. I mean, in one sense, it's obviously true because the definition of premature optimization means you're doing it before you should. So in that case, it's just a tautology in some sense. It wouldn't be premature if it was the right time to do it, right? Saying it's the root of all evil, I suppose, isn't a tautology because, hey, the root of all evil is a pretty bold claim. But in terms of whether it's wasted work to optimize things at any time other than the end, the answer is no, it isn't necessarily. And the reason for that is because, and like I said, this is why you kind of have to just know and have some taste about it, because it's something that's a very difficult call to make. Optimization is not something you can just do, right? If you have structured the way the code works to preclude optimization from occurring, then it's not going to be really possible for you to optimize it at the end, not without rewriting massive amounts of the code, right? So one of the things that you learn to do as you get better at programming is to structure your code such that you know you're not precluding any optimizations that you think you might need to make, and you will start optimizing certain pieces of code what would otherwise be prematurely, because you know that you don't want to build dependencies on that code until you see that it can be made optimal, right? So sometimes you do need to do a little bit, or a lot even, of optimization on a piece of code because you know that how other code works will be dependent on it, and getting it into and not having it in the state it should be for later release is going to be a problem, right? So basically, that call is a very hard call to make. What I can say is 90% of the time, you really don't want to do much with optimization until you have to. 90% of the time. But maybe 10% or maybe 5% of the time, I don't know what the actual real percentage is. We don't have hard metrics on things like this. You do need to think about optimization up front. And you do need to do some, and you need to have some ideas about exactly how you are going to make this code work the way it needs to for shipping. Because letting it go too long will have negative consequences as assumptions about that code ripple out through the code base. So you really need to have a good idea of how things are being dependent on each other and what things may create problems during the release cycle during optimization if they're done wrong. Maybe something for next week, but can you make the boundary wall heights equal? I don't know that I want the boundary wall heights to be equal, so I probably won't do that, but it'd be pretty easy to do, obviously, yes. All right. Let's close out here. All right, thank you everyone for joining me for another episode of Handmade Hero. It's been a pleasure coding with you as always. If you would like to follow along the series at home, you can always pre-order the game on handmadehero.org, and it comes with a source code so you can play around with it yourself. For example, if you want to make all the boundary wall height equal, you can easily go do that in the code as it stands right now. It's a pretty simple change to make. Other than that, I will be back here next week. If you would like to see how we're going to lay out our rooms and actually make them connect in a real way so that we can start to have a game world that you can explore and have fun in, we will be doing that next weekend, so hope to see you back here for that. In the meantime, if you want to catch up on old episodes, definitely check out the episode guide. It's pretty amazing at this point. You can search for all sorts of things and watch old episodes or clips from old episodes that are pertinent to things you want to know about. until next weekend, that's something you can check out, or do some of your own coding. Have some fun. I don't know. Whatever you're working on right now, do something cool on it. Until next weekend, take it easy, everybody, and I'll see you on the internet.